Calder's life probably has lots of lessons for us today. But I think that one of the more poignant ones is that we shouldn't always wait for an invitation to act. The CCF didn't go out and recruit Calder. They never invited Calder to come into the party and help change its thinking on Indigenous issues. Calder acted on his own accord. He saw a party that had a commitment to economic and social justice. But when it came to Indigenous issues, it was not fulfilling that commitment. He never waited for someone to ask him to make history. He just went ahead and did it. Hi, and welcome to episode 15 of season 1 of Social Democrats of the North, presented by the Broadbent Institute's Perspectives Journal podcast series. I'm your host, Dave McGrane, professor of political science at St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan, and a member of the Perspectives Journal Editorial Committee. From Confederation to the Quiet Revolution, Social Democrats of the North takes you on a journey through history to discover the lives and ideas of the leaders who have shaped Canadian social democracy. It examines the history of social democracy in Canada and provides you with tips for your own political activism. In the last episode, I looked at MJ Coldwell, whose leadership helped ensure that the CCF became a long-lasting force in Canadian politics. In this episode, we are going to take a look at the life and times of one of the most famous social democrats from an Indigenous background in Canada in the post-war period. I'm talking about Frank Calder, the first status Indigenous person to be elected at either the provincial or federal level in Canada. Before I describe Calder's life and ideas, I just want to make a couple of brief comments about the role that Indigenous people played in Canadian social democracy up until the end of World War II. To be blunt, they actually played no role at all. Despite the extreme injustices experienced by Indigenous people, Canadian social democratic politicians and activists generally accepted the way that Indigenous people were treated in the first half of the 20th century. Perhaps because Indigenous people were not voters, these early Canadian social democrats never visited Indigenous communities. They never mentioned Indigenous people or Indigenous issues in their speeches, platforms, pamphlets, and books. Moreover, Indigenous people were not welcome into social democratic political parties, and they were often denied membership in Canadian unions. So, early Canadian social democrats claimed to be concerned with eliminating poverty and creating a more caring and compassionate society. Yet they completely ignored and excluded Indigenous people who were forced to endure unimaginable poverty and discrimination every day of their lives. In short, early Canadian social democrats refused to back up their ideals with action. Frank Calder understood this situation all too well. He was born in 1915 in a small and remote Nisga'a community in the Naze River Valley in northern British Columbia. While the rivers, forest, and ocean around his community was wild and stunning, his people lived in extreme poverty. They definitely did not have any of the comforts and luxuries enjoyed by southern British Columbians. On top of this, most of the Nisga'a land had been confiscated from them in the late 19th century. Their land had been given to white settlers, even though the Nisga'a had never formally legally ceded title. From 1900 to 1945, the Nisga'a hired several lawyers and lobbied all levels of government to get their land claims addressed. But no matter what they did, governments and the courts were completely uninterested in hearing their case. The Nisga'a often expressed frustration by comparing the progress that they made in their land claim as being like trying to move a mountain. It was impossible. The image of the advancement of the Nisga'a land claim being similar to an unmovable mountain ended up playing a very large and important role in Calder's life. Before Calder was born, a Nisga'a elder had a vision come to her in a vivid dream. Na Kuan, the child of the Killer Whale Nisga'a clan, had died at birth. In her dream, the elder foretold that the sister of the wife of the chief of the Killer Whale clan would soon have a baby boy. And this baby boy would have the spirit of Na Kaun, the child that had died at birth. This is exactly what happened. So Frank Calder, who was the baby boy, was adopted by the grieving chief and his wife. The unique circumstances of his birth convinced the chief and members of the Killer Whale clan that Calder had a special purpose. When Calder was only 6 years old, his adoptive father was discussing the lack of progress on the Nisga'a land claim at a gathering of all clans. All of a sudden, he stopped the meeting. He instructed the young Calder to stand on the table. He then announced, This boy, this dream boy, I'm going to send to a white area. He will learn the ways of the white man. He will speak like a white, eat like a white man, and walk like a white man. Then he will move that mountain. From this point onward in his life, many Nisga'a people believed that Calder had a special destiny to fulfill. He was going to live in both the world of the Nisga'a and the world of white people. He was going to be the one to finally settle the Nisga'a land claim. He was going to be the one to finally move the mountain. Despite the poverty of his community, Calder had a happy childhood. He discovered the beauty of the Nisga'a lands and learnt his people's traditional ways of hunting and gathering. Then, when he was 9, something dramatic happened. He was sent away to attend a residential school, far from his home community. Later in his life, he said that he did not suffer any abuse during his time at this residential school, but he did have to be flexible and adapt to his new circumstances. At the residential school, Calder excelled at academics and at sports. He was popular with students and teachers alike, and had always graduated at the top of his class. At the same time, he made an enormous effort to maintain his Nisga'a language and cultural traditions, since he could only visit his parents during the summer months. When it came to the end of grade 10, all of his Nisga'a classmates returned back to live in the Naas River Valley. But Calder did not. His adopted father had given him a task. He had to learn the ways of the world outside of his Nisga'a community so he could finally settle his people's land claim. He had to somehow live in the world of white settlers without ever forgetting where he came from. So, Calder continued to live at the residential school and enrolled as the only Indigenous student at the public high school in Chilliwack to complete grade 11 and grade 12. If finishing high school was rare for an Indigenous person in the late 1930s in British Columbia, going to university was completely unheard of. Yet Calder was unafraid to make such a bold move. He became the first Indigenous student at the University of British Columbia and its first Indigenous graduate when he obtained a Bachelor of Theology degree in 1945. Calder wanted to pursue doctoral studies in theology to become an Anglican minister, but he lacked the money to pay for tuition. To save money up, he joined the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union and worked at a fish processing plant in Prince Rupert. He was elected to his local union executive, even though the membership was exclusively white. At the same time, he kept up an active interest in Indigenous politics and became the president of the North American Native Brotherhood in 1945. By the end of the 1940s, things were going according to Calder's plan. He was about to turn 35, and he would soon have enough money to do his doctorate in theology at Washington State University. After becoming an Anglican minister, he would work among the Indigenous people of British Columbia. He would figure out a way to use the resources of the Anglican Church to improve their lives. But then something happened that would totally alter the path he would take. The 1949 British Columbia provincial election was the first British Columbia provincial election in which Indigenous people could vote and run as candidates. Only a few months before the campaign was set to begin, Calder was visiting his home community, and the Liberal candidate, who was the incumbent MLA for the area, stayed for 3 days at the Calder house due to bad weather. The Liberal MLA informed Calder that no one was actually running in the election against him, and even suggested that Calder could be a candidate himself. The MLA would go on to regret his words. The Nisga'a had unsuccessfully been trying for years to get governments to address their land claim, and they wanted governments to provide services to their communities that were comparable to what southern non-Indigenous British Columbians enjoyed. Nothing seemed to work, so Calder made a daring decision to try something different. He was not a member of a political party at the time, and no political party had ever paid any attention to his community. But he gravitated towards the CCF because of his union background and because he felt the party had always represented the interests of the poor. And Indigenous people, in his view, definitely fell into that category. With the support of the Nisga'a and other new Indigenous voters in the riding, Calder became the CCF candidate and subsequently defeated the sitting Liberal MLA. He became the first status Indigenous person to be elected to any provincial or federal legislature in the history of Canada. From this point on, Calder truly entered the white man's world as his adopted father had predicted. Like so many other times in his life, Calder would have to adapt quickly to his new surroundings. It is important to note that Calder had not been recruited by the BC CCF to run for the party. And, as I had mentioned, the CCF had a poor record in terms of advocating for Indigenous issues. Whether he liked it or not, Calder found himself caught between two worlds. Within British Columbia's Indigenous communities, he would have to defend how the CCF had failed to give high profile to Indigenous issues. And he would have to defend his view that electoral politics was an effective way to improve the lives of Indigenous people. Within the CCF, he would have to force the party to pay attention to an issue that it had long ignored. Calder's first move was to draft a Bill of Rights that would give equal rights to all British Columbians regardless of their sex, language, religion, or race. Calder explained to his CCF colleagues that Indigenous people faced more discrimination in their daily lives than other citizens and were more routinely accorded inadequate levels of services by governments than other citizens. This was not to say that other British Columbians did not face discrimination and did not have inadequate government services, only that the situation was worse for Indigenous people. Calder noted that even the labor movement that was affiliated to the CCF had historically made it difficult for Indigenous people to join its ranks and have access to good-paying jobs. He made it clear that this discriminatory treatment and lack of government services created suffering for Indigenous people, and that a truly compassionate British Columbia would do something to alleviate that suffering. When it came to this Bill of Rights, what Calder was saying may seem evident to a Social Democrat living in Canada in 2026. But it was very different from what most Social Democrats in Canada thought in 1949 when Calder made this suggestion. At this time, Canadian Social Democrats looked at poverty in a very undifferentiated way. They thought that there was poor people and there were rich people, so what matters is someone's class, not their race. In this sense, early Canadian Social Democrats did not recognize that Indigenous people could systematically be poorer and systematically be more oppressed than white people. They did not understand the specific circumstances of Indigenous people that made their situation worse than other citizens in society. Calder challenged this type of thinking. He believed that a Bill of Rights could be used as a tool to fight the discrimination aimed at Indigenous people and rectify situations where the government was not providing the services that Indigenous communities so badly needed. Calder stated in his maiden speech to the British Columbia legislature in 1949 the following: "Today, the Indian stands as a second-class citizen, robbed of his native rights, his water, fish, and timber rights. Half of his trap lines are gone. My picture of a full Magna Carta for natives is equal opportunity in education, in health, in employment, and in citizenship." Calder was able to convince his CCF colleagues to support his cause. So in the first year that he was in the British Columbia legislature, and for many years afterwards, he called for a provincial Bill of Rights. This Bill of Rights would guarantee that all British Columbians were assured the same level of government services and were not discriminated against in terms of wages, employment, or membership in unions and professional associations. While he always was supported by his colleagues in the CCF and the NDP, the Liberal and Conservative MLAs on the other side of the BC legislature voted against him. Calder became an important part of the CCF and later the NDP. He would go on to have a very long political career representing his northern British Columbia riding from 1949 to 1979, with the exception of one 4-year period from 1956 to 1960. While he was MLA, Calder also became the chief of the Killer Whale Nisga'a clan and continued to be very involved in Indigenous groups, such as the Native Brotherhood of British Columbia. Having to act as a bridge between British Columbia's Indigenous communities and the CCF or the NDP meant that Calder felt the need to publicly disagree with his party at certain times. One such occasion was the Nisga'a land claim, the very reason many Nisga'a felt that Calder had become elected in the first place. After being in the BC legislature for many years, Calder realized that neither the federal government nor the provincial government had any interest in moving the Nisga'a land claim forward. Calder was not a lawyer, but in 1966, a young lawyer by the name of Thomas Berger was elected as the NDP MLA for Vancouver Burrard. Calder decided that maybe his connections within the world of white settler politics could help out the Nisga'a land claim. So he convinced Berger to do something that politicians didn't normally do. In 1967, they filed a lawsuit against the BC government regarding the Nisga'a land claim. The lawsuit was brought by Frank Calder and 16 other Nisga'a chiefs and elders on behalf of the Nisga'a people, and Berger acted as the lawyer representing the group. For the next 6 years, Calder's case moved slowly through the courts at a snail's pace. In fact, Calder and Berger lost the initial court cases and decided to appeal them to see what a higher level of court would find. They refused to take no for an answer, keeping the case alive like a flame in the wind that would not be blown out. As the court case moved along, BC politics did not stop. In fact, Berger became NDP leader, and Calder was one of his key MLAs in the legislature, taking on a big role in opposing the social credit government. But the 1969 provincial election was not a good one for the BC NDP. The party's vote dropped and Berger even lost his own seat. The only silver line was that Berger would have more time to concentrate on the Nisga'a land claim case. It was not until 1973 that Berger, Calder, and the Nisga'a finally got in front of the Supreme Court of Canada. Berger and Calder's unconditional move of being MLAs suing their provincial governments paid off. The ruling by the Supreme Court of Canada in the Calder case ended up being a landmark victory for Indigenous rights in Canada. It is a pretty complex ruling, but essentially it was the first time the Supreme Court of Canada recognized that Indigenous land rights that had existed prior to European settlement still had legal force. This led Canadian governments to begin to negotiate land claims with Indigenous nations whose territories had never been covered by treaties. By the time the Supreme Court released its decision on the Calder case, the BC NDP was in power. NDP Premier Dave Barrett appointed Calder as the first Indigenous cabinet minister in Canadian history. He was not given a portfolio, but was instructed to study Indigenous issues and report back to cabinet. The federal government wanted to open up negotiations with the provincial NDP government and the Nisga'a to settle the outstanding land claim that had been the subject of the Calder case. Sensing that talking about Indigenous land claims would be unpopular with voters, the BC NDP government claimed that it had more pressing economic issues with which to deal and said it would not participate in negotiations. The Nisga'a land claim was stalled again, this time by Calder's own party. In reaction, Calder made a risky move. He publicly expressed his disappointment with his own party and called on the BC government to get to the negotiating table. Tensions started to grow between Calder and the Premier's office. Then something happened that no one saw coming. Calder was involved in an incident where he was accused of drunk driving. Even though he was never found guilty of the charge, he lost his cabinet position, and Barrett announced that he had lost confidence in Calder altogether. It was a low point in Calder's life. The Nisga'a land claim was not moving forward, and he was no longer a cabinet minister. In fact, the Premier was no longer assigning him any substantial duties at all. His daily activities began to lack importance. He felt bored and sensed a lack of meaning in his life. It looked like things couldn't get any worse, but they did. In 1975, Barrett called a snap election and caught everyone off guard because it was only 3 years into the NDP's mandate. Even Calder didn't know it was going to happen. He was completely surprised. Then the news became even more unbelievable. Calder was told that a nomination had already taken place in his riding and another NDP candidate had been selected to run in his place. His political career was dissolving quickly before his eyes. He had faithfully served the CCF and the NDP for 26 years, and now the party was unceremoniously dumping him. After years of hard work for the party, he felt like he was being swept aside without a word of thanks. He needed to adapt quickly to his new set of circumstances. Calder responded by deciding to run for the right-wing Social Credit Party in his northern riding. Social Credit had not said much about the Nisga'a land claim, but Calder hoped that he would be able to persuade them to start negotiations if they formed government. Social Credit won a landslide victory over the NDP, and Calder easily won his riding as a Social Credit candidate. Unfortunately, Calder was not made a cabinet minister, and he languished on the backbenches of the new Social Credit government. Worse yet, the new government refused to enter into negotiation on the Nisga'a land claim. Even if he had switched parties, Calder could still not achieve progress on the most important issue facing his community. Calder stayed on as a Social Credit MLA for one term, but he was defeated by an NDP candidate in the 1979 provincial election by only one vote. Many Nisga'a ended up voting against Calder because it was apparent that his defection to Social Credit had done little to advance the progress of their community's land claim. Further, they were unhappy with Social Credit's austerity budgets that had led to significant cuts to social programs. At the age of 65, Calder finally retired from electoral politics, but he continued to live in two worlds. He remained active in several Indigenous organizations while teaching at the University of British Columbia. It was not until the NDP came back into power in 1991 that the British Columbia provincial government finally entered into negotiations to settle the Nisga'a land claim. A settlement was eventually reached in 2000. It was a full 79 years after Calder's father had announced that he would enter the world of the white man to learn their ways and settle the Nisga'a land claim. Calder was able to attend the ceremony marking the passage of the land claim into law. It had taken a long time, but as had been foretold so long ago, Calder had finally moved the proverbial mountain. He had finally brought about the settlement of the Nisga'a land claim. Not long after, he fell ill and died of cancer. Calder had a huge impact on Canadian politics. He will long be remembered for being the first status Indigenous person to be elected at either the federal or provincial level in Canada. And his involvement in the Calder case laid the legal foundation for many successful Indigenous land claims in the 21st century. What is talked about less, though, is his contribution to Canadian social democracy. Indigenous voters and Indigenous issues were simply not on the radar of Canadian Social Democrats at the end of World War II. Calder came into the CCF NDP and revolutionized the way that Social Democrats thought about poverty and social justice in Canada, even if this meant that he often had to criticize his own party to do so. Calder's life probably has lots of lessons for us today, but I think that one of the more poignant ones is that we shouldn't always wait for an invitation to act. The CCF didn't go out and recruit Calder. They never invited Calder to come into the party and help change its thinking on Indigenous issues. Calder acted on his own accord. He saw a party that had a commitment to economic and social justice. But when it came to Indigenous issues, it was not fulfilling that commitment. He never waited for someone to ask him to make history. He just went ahead and did it. I'm Dave McGrane, and thanks for joining me on Social Democrats of the North, a Perspectives Journal podcast series produced by the Broadbent Institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a review on the Perspectives Journal podcast on all major podcast platforms, and share with someone you know who loves Canadian political history. And subscribe to Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories that you won't find in any major newspaper. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more about social democracy in the Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca. And for more information on the Broadbent Institute's work, subscribe to our mailing list at broadbentinstitute.ca/subscribe. We'll be taking a break for the summer, but be sure to tune in next fall to discover the lives and ideas of more social democratic leaders who helped shape the history of Canada. Until then, keep questioning the status quo and stay social democratic.